Hi everybody, Kevin Greenway from 10ZiG here, and today I'm going to be demonstrating a deep dive of NOS-C, our 10ZiG Citrix 0 client. Hopefully you've already had a chance to look at the previous video in this particular series, which is the NOS-C Citrix 0 client quick start guide. So this particular video expands on that by going into more of a deep dive in terms of additional connection types to Citrix, as well as some additional configuration options that you might want to consider to fine-tune the deployment. So we'll start out this video the same way as we did with the quick start guide, just to unravel how simple that piece of things is, and then we'll go ahead and we'll expand on that. So again, you can see those differences. So the first step of the quick start guide is to set the country. Now again, I will just add the fact that this video is all about setting up the client locally. If you do have the 10ZiG manager, the 10ZiG manager can automatically detect the client, push out a configuration template automatically, and have the client in effect ready for use. So this is all about local configuration, and then the 10ZiG manager comes into play later on. So again, first step is setting the country. I'm just going to stick with the default of US. So the fact we can demonstrate time zones. So I'm going to select Phoenix here, and then I'm going to input today's time and date, which is correct as of now. The third and final step is specifying the Citrix storefront URL. So again, let's just explore some of the connection types on offer here. So the default Citrix storefront receiver for web is there to allow you to connect to, as it says, the Citrix storefront deployment, and specifically the receiver for website. And similarly, you can use the same connection type to connect to a Citrix NetScaler, also to Citrix Workspace and Citrix Cloud. And before it, for anybody that's using legacy, you can also use it to connect to Citrix Web Interface. In addition, we have two more connection types as well. I'll be demonstrating this one afterwards, the Web API PN Agent. XML Broker is really for legacy deployments, so I won't be demonstrating that particular one in this series. So for the server address, again, it's the receiver for web URL. Now, I'm specifically going to use a different server address than we used in the quick start guide, with the purpose to demonstrate the process of importing a certificate to the Citrix 0 client. So the previous example connected to a storefront server that had a commercial certificate assigned to it, and as mentioned in that video, commercial certificates are already by default present within the firmware, so they are in effect baked in. But what happens if, like this environment, you're connecting to an on-premise internal Citrix environment and you've used an Active Directory signed certificate? So it's really quite straightforward. You can import the chain or the root certificate onto the 0 client, and again, you can do that through the 10ZiG manager as well, but this particular demonstration is going to cover how to get it on through a USB stick. So when I click OK here, what's going to happen is it's going to launch the 0 web browser, and as you can see, it errors out with the fact we haven't been able to validate the certificate. So we click OK to that message, we quit out the 0 web browser, and we can go into the control panel where we can then go through the process of importing the certificate. But just before we do that, let's just review a couple of things, the things that were done in that quick start wizard. So first of all, we have the time and date. So there's the current time and date. We also have the time zone, and if we go into keyboard, the keyboard language, as you can see, is set to English US. I'm actually going to change that to English UK, with the fact that I am in reality in the UK, as you can probably tell by my accent. And at the same time, I'm going to set the time zone here to be Europe, and specifically London. Okay, so in regards to certificates, now if we go into certificates, as mentioned, we have a number of base certificates. So the base certificates are part of the Zero web browser. So a number of different authorities that are already in here, as well as imported certificates, which are in effect those certificates that are bundled with the Citrix Workspace app or Citrix receiver. So again, if I want to import additional certificates through a USB, the first thing that I have to do is under the control panel, come to security settings and enable the installation from USB storage. The next thing that I need to do is to format a thumb drive, or take a thumb drive that's already formatted with FAT32. And if you place your root certificate or your certificate bundle onto the root of the thumb drive, either in PEM, CRT or PFX format, and plug the thumb drive into the Zero client as I'm doing here, and just give it a few seconds to enumerate the drive, and there we go. So the process has now detected the presence of a certificate on the root of that thumb drive, as well as other different variables that we can install into the firmware, and allows me to go ahead. So I'm not going to install this one. This is for a different environment. I'm just going to install our regular root CA. So when I click install, that should have installed. If we go back to certificates and imported certificates, we can now see that we have the 10ZiG-DC-CA certificate. And if we click show, we can view the attributes of that certificate. Now, we're not quite done there yet because of the fact that we're using the Zero web browser. So the next step that we have to do is to add that particular certificate as a trusted authority. So to do that, we click on manage here, we go to or stick at authorities, and we click import, and we import again off the thumb drive, which is SDB1 in this case. And again, we take the same certificate file that we took in that previous step. We click open, and then we choose to trust this CA to identify websites. We click OK, and OK out again. Close that, close the control panel, and hopefully now when we attempt to log back in, the certificate will have been verified. Which it has. So that quick step was just to set up Citrix, or a connection to Citrix, and in effect import the root certificate. So now that I'm done with that, I'm just going to remove that thumb drive, quit out of here, and then come back to security settings and turn that option off. So that is a recommendation. Only turn that option on temporarily during setup to prevent regular users arriving to the endpoint and plugging all sorts of crazy wallpapers in. So that's that option there. Now, whilst we're in the control panel, let's just look at some of the other commonly set options. So we have lockdown control panel. So as you've seen so far, whenever I go into the control panel, I've got free access. So if we want to lock the control panel down, we can just put in a password here, and that will then require the user or the administrator, in this case, to insert the password whenever they go into the control panel. Now, we take the approach that if we lock the control panel down, we want to empower the user with certain user-based attributes. So for example, we might want to allow the user to be able to change their display resolution and change their display layout. So we might choose to allow that to remain. And we also might want to choose to allow the user to adjust their sound properties. So for example, if they're arriving to the endpoint with a particular headset and they want to either set that as the default or increase or decrease the volume, then again, we can choose them to allow to do that. But these other options like keyboard, mouse, even network. So if we don't want the user to, for example, change wireless or wired settings, we can turn that off. And in this case, we want to allow power options to remain on so that the user can shut down and reboot the Zero client. So we click OK. And once we come out of the control panel, we can see now that the menu bar here is in effect taking those settings. So when I go into sound, as I mentioned before, the user can adjust those settings and they can also adjust the display. But when they go into the control panel, they are required to insert the password. So it's as simple as that, as locking the terminal down. If we go into the Citrix settings, let's just explore some of the commonly set options here and just talk about those. So the first option here is enable hardware decoding. This is specifically H.264 hardware decoding, which is available on the Intel-based 10ZiG 0 clients. Now, it is important to state that as it stands, this particular feature can only be enabled in conjunction with where you have the Citrix video codec option set to full screen. So if you're using the Citrix HDX 3D Pro template or the high definition user experience template, then that in effect turns the video codec to full screen, and this can then be used in conjunction with that, and that can be used to improve and increase performance as well as reducing overhead on the endpoint, with the fact that the decoding is done in hardware. But again, just be aware that to use it, you are required to set the video codec to full screen on your delivery groups or VDAs. We also have the option here of auto launching the default URL. So what that in effect does is when the endpoint boots, it doesn't just sit at the menu bar that we saw before, it actually launches the Zero web browser. So if you want to turn that off so that the user instead sees just the menu bar, then it's a simple click of the box here. We can also use this to add multiple server addresses into this server address field. So for example, if I wanted to add in another Citrix server address here, I can just comma delimit that field, and when I click OK, let me just turn this off for a second. When I click on OK and close the control panel, you can see that I've got both options here, so I can connect to multiple Citrix servers. I'm just going to delete that one out, so it leaves us with the one that I put in before, and I'm also going to set that back. Now there's some other couple of options here that are worth just mentioning as well. So kiosk mode, if you turn that on, as it says, it will hide that desktop launch pad or the menu bar. And hide decorations, if you turn that on, it will in effect disable the menu bar, which gives the option of quitting out of the Zero web browser that we saw before. So configure those based on your needs. The web API and PN agent we'll come back to once we explore that connection type. Under login, we can use this area here to enable things like smart card login, which is under here. We can also use this area to prefix any credentials that want to sign in either to the receiver for web or the web API and PN agent. And we also have this neat little feature that we can use to, in effect, launch another copy of the Zero web browser to connect to a user's password reset server. So if the particular deployment enables users to reset their passwords by going to a particular website, then drop that in here. And again, once that's enabled, so let me just point it to Google in this case, that will again enable another option inside the menu bar. Now under log off action, as the user logs off, we can make some decisions about what happens next. So some deployments, for example, choose to shut down the endpoints as a user logs off at the end of the day, again as part of the automation. Now, not so common these days, but you can use the proxy if you either want to proxy the connection to Citrix, as well as historically or for legacy deployments using a proxy for HDX flash redirection. Under reconnection, there are some reconnection timers, so that if, for example, the Citrix connection's dropped, a reconnection will be attempted by default after 30 seconds, and it will reconnect for 3 attempts. Now, under the advanced, we generally don't recommend that you change a lot of these settings. A lot of the settings in here are configured with optimal defaults in mind. However, I just want to mention a couple that are worthy to note. So session reliability. This is a different means of connecting your Citrix desktops and applications. It's fairly recent, within the last 2 or 3 years, feature of the Citrix Workspace app for Linux, and before it Citrix Receiver for Linux. But this in effect changes the transport or the connectivity to TCP 2598, and if you turn that off, that does default to the original ICA client TCP 1494. So more recently, that has been enabled by default just because of the fact that that's the standard for Citrix. But if you are recommended, for example, to turn session reliability off, or you're connecting to some sort of legacy environment, it might be required to turn that off. There's also the connection bar. So where we turn this on, that will enable the connection bar in the upper portion of the desktop, so that the user can choose to use that to, for example, disconnect out of session. So again, useful dependent on the type of deployment. We also have the session end key. So where enabled, users can use the series of F keys here in effect to disconnect or end the session. So again, quite a useful feature. And nice one here is show host name. So show host name will show the host name, so that as the user is being shadowed by an administrator, the user can inform the administrator about their host name, to enable the user of the 10ZiG manager to quickly find that particular user and then shadow them. So I'll leave that on so that you can see that after this particular step. Client drive mapping. This is you got two options here. So this is essentially if you're looking to plug in a USB thumb drive and pass that through to your Citrix desktop or application. By default, we use client drive mapping, which is preferred by Citrix. If you want to disable that, that in effect gives you an option of USB redirecting those thumb drives. So two different ways to connect thumb drives, either client drive mapping or USB redirection. So we'll leave it as default for now. And then finally, HDX over UDP. So this is the adaptive transport, which is becoming much more standard these days, and probably in the not too distant future, this option will become default as well. So if you do want to enable that HDX adaptive transport, it's a simple checkbox here, as well as a setting within Citrix Studio to apply that as well. So that's those options set for Citrix. If we quit out of here now, you can see we've got again a slight change here in the desktop launcher. So here's our terminal name. So again, that's what the user can use to alert the administrator towards finding them in the 10ZiG Manager console. And additionally, the password reset option. So as the user clicks on that, again, it goes towards that URL that we put in the password reset URL. The user can effectively go through a sequence here to reset their password. And as it's done, they can quit out to return to the Citrix menu. So what I'm going to do is just going to quickly log in here. But to do that, of course, I need to make sure my URL is in there. So I'm now going to sign in. And from there, I can connect to any number of desktops or applications. So I'm just going to click into this RDSH based Citrix desktop, just so that you can see what the login flow is like. You can see I've also got the connection bar, which, as mentioned, allows us to switch, disconnect, sign out, etc. So again, use that dependent on use case. So let me sign out of that desktop now. Let me log off of Citrix, and let's start to just look at the alternative connection type that we mentioned before, which is the web API / PN agent. So the use case for receiver for web, as you see, is it gives the same native user experience for users of 10ZiG endpoints, as well as any other users on things like laptops, Chromebooks, MacBooks, tablets. But where the web API PN agent comes into really good use is the fact that you can customize the user experience. So with the receiver for web, you're very dependent on the features of Storefront and the user interacting with the Zero web browser. But with the web API, we can use these additional options here to tweak the experience of login. So for example, by default, we choose to reconnect applications or desktops at login. So if you've logged into a desktop or an application at another workstation or another thin client, then that application and desktop will follow you. So you can turn that off. It can also auto connect if you only have a single desktop or application available, as well as doing things like auto connect to favorite desktops. Now, one of the commonly set settings here is auto connect by name. So you can use this to, for example, that desktop that I previously connected to specify that here, so that in effect it's single sign-on. So the user authenticates, and the web API launches that user's desktop in this case without any further user intervention. So we'll turn that off for now. And we can also choose to hide the resource list. So with the web API and PN agent, once we authenticate, we enumerate the user's applications and desktops to a resource list, which again we can choose to hide. We can also, as the user logs out of the desktop or application, choose to close that list on exit. So again, it's much more seamless, as well as additional options such as enabling another password change server through sequence of login, as well as choosing to hide things like the domain field and the read-only or make it read-only field on login. And also server certificate. So with this particular connection type, we can choose to change the server certificate handling from either accept, warning, or reject. But again, because of the fact that in the previous step we imported the certificate in here, it should in effect connect without any issue. So with that connection change done, if we click on OK here and we close the control panel, and let me just put the correct URL in. So with this particular connection type, I forgot to put in the exact URL. So again, we've got to point towards the exact receiver for web site here, which in our case is /citrix /10ZiG UK web. Once I click on OK, close the control panel, you can see that that is now allowing us to authenticate. So what we've done at this point, this connection is in effect communicating with Storefront in this case, and it pulls back attributes, as we can see, such as the domain field that is pre-configured into Storefront. Now you can also use this same connection type for Citrix Cloud and Citrix Workspace as well. So straight away you can see there's a change in workflow here as the user signs in. So again, if I sign in with those same credentials that we took before, and once logged in and authenticated, it takes us to the favorites tab. So similarly to the Zero web, we've got our favorites, and then we've got our desktops and our apps. So again, it's a bit more seamless in the fact that we can start to configure this. So I'm not going to connect to a desktop as yet. I'm just going to log off of here, and I'm going to do a bit more fine tuning in that if I go under here and I turn off this, I enable the auto connection by name, and I'm also going to choose to hide the resource list as well as close that list on exit, so that again you can see a very simple and elegant sign-on sequence. So I'm going to sign back in. And now once I sign in, what will happen is that desktop will automatically launch, as we can see it's doing. And obviously, like anything, the speed is dependent on the network and the back end. So it's automatically logging me into my preferred desktop. And similarly, once I log out of here, it in effect should log me out all of the way. Again, probably just waiting for that desktop to close. It has, and it's logged me back all out of the way and leaves that ready for the next user to log in. So those two connection types, very much the most common. Again, you've got different use cases for each, and hopefully with that demo, that's explains some of that to apply to your particular use case. Okay, so the next area just worthy of explaining is printers. So with printers, we can either USB redirect printers, and this is just locally attached printers, by the way. So we can either USB redirect them, which is configured in another area that you'll see in a moment, as well as adding printers through here, which leverages the virtual printing. So if we do want to add any printers in here, we have the option of adding a USB printer or LPD, LPR, or RAW type printer, which are your Jet Direct type printers. I'm not going to configure that area here because it's again a sequence of another particular video in the series. So I'm going to close out of that here. I am going to go into USB devices and just briefly explain this area in terms of how it applies to Citrix. So we can use this area to apply the rules of how we want different USB devices to be redirected to our desktop and application. So first off, we can apply the rules to those USB classes. So for example, you can see that by default we pass mass storage devices through. But if we want to exclude that by default, we can do that here. And again, with printers, we can choose that if we plug a printer into the endpoint, that it will be redirected through USB redirection in this case. Now, in addition to setting the class devices, if you plug in any particular types of peripherals, they will show here, like for example the mouse, and you can choose to, it's default by default, which means that it takes from the class, which in this case, because it's HID, human interface device, which is here, the default means in this case that it will be excluded, which is correct. But if you want to override that, we can choose to include. Another one just to mention is webcam devices. So webcam devices are natively excluded because of the fact that you use instead the HDX real-time compression or some of the optimization features such as the Skype for Business optimization pack, and in future hopefully the Teams optimization. So that's USB device redirection, which can be configured on the endpoint. It's also worth mentioning sound. So can't give you a very detailed demo here with the fact that the Zero client's running as a virtual machine, but if we want to choose a preferred audio input and output device, we can plug in a headset and we can choose those from here. And we can also choose the option here if you're using the terminal or the endpoint in a quiet environment like a library, choose to disable the onboard speaker. You can also choose to enable USB audio hot plug. So this is good where you're in effect in a hot desking environment and users are arriving to the endpoints. They plug the USB audio device in, and that takes effect over the default internal audio that's applicable to the 10ZiG endpoint. You can also disable HDMI output. So if you don't want the audio to go through into the monitor or the HDMI display, turn that off here. And you can also choose to disable any specific audio. For example, if you wanted to forward something like a USB headset through USB redirection instead, using the method I mentioned in the previous step. So that's sound. If we also just want to look at VNC service, by default this is set to on demand, which means that a user of the 10ZiG Manager console can shadow the 10ZiG Citrix 0 client, but you can change that to be on boot, which means that any VNC user can connect to the 10ZiG Citrix 0 client. You can also completely disable that, and then you can tweak options to make it more secure. So for example, choose to show an accept or reject dialog box to the user and automatically accept that after, by default, 5 seconds, as well as require the 10ZiG Manager user to input a password before they're allowed to shadow the user, and then finally notify the user where the shadowing starts and stops. So that's VNC. The Cloud Manager is where we can, in effect, configure the 0 client to connect to a cloud-based manager of your choosing for managing that over the internet. And then, I guess last but not least, is the sidebar taskbar. So the sidebar taskbar is there to support some of the more modern workplaces like Citrix Workspace and Citrix Cloud, where users are probably not necessarily launching desktops or just desktops. They might be launching more applications. So if we turn that on, we can see that the sidebar by default appears in the left-hand side, and this is a placeholder where, as the user logs in and they connect to applications, those applications are stored on the taskbar or sidebar, and the user can use that area to switch between applications. So that's just a simple turn on and off, and then you can configure that to select between whether it's minimal or full, and also things like the position as well as other options. So that concludes this particular demo. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please check out our other videos available on youtube.com, on the 10ZiG channel, and any other of our FAQs that are available on 10ZiG.com. Thank you very much.